Nancy Pelosi's 25th Amendment threat, ploy. It was set up, and I say set up in the sense that I think Tim Pool, I don't know if he was the first person to suggest the idea. I do know that he's suggested the idea, and it's a very interesting idea, that this has nothing to do with Trump. This is a setup for if and when Biden gets elected, to get him out and get Kamala in. Although, in reality, if Trump gets elected, I have no doubt if she has a way to invoke the 25th, she'll do it. So just to give the context to people, what is the 25th and what is the history of the 25th? And a stupid question, all of these amendments are obviously chronological, right? So the 25th Amendment was added after the 24th and so on and so forth. So what happened that led to the 25th Amendment?
So the concern behind the 25th Amendment was what happens if you have a president that's incapacitated, and there isn't an election yet. So, and I forget which president it was that triggered that concern, but there was a sequence of events that triggered it. So that's why they passed it. Now, we've actually had that situation. Woodrow Wilson was probably incapacitated a large part of the last 6 months of his term, and his wife was actually the acting president functionally, but not legally. But we didn't have the 25th Amendment at that time. So the protocol for the 25th Amendment is if he becomes incapacitated, the vice president becomes the acting president. Now, what happens if there's a dispute about whether or not, in fact, he's incapacitated? What has to happen is the vice president will become the acting president if he and half of the member of the cabinet, a majority of the cabinet, say, we tell Congress he's incapacitated. Now, what if the president disputes that he's incapacitated? Then there has to be a vote in both houses of Congress, and 2/3 of both houses of Congress have to say he's incapacitated. Otherwise, he's back as president.
Now, I'm going to ask the stupid question. Incapacitated politically, or do they need medical expertise to actually come to this determination? Is this a political thing, or is it a medical scientific thing?
It's functionally political because there's no requirement, there's no legal definition of it, of incapacity that is met by judicial standard. So in other words, whatever decision is made by the vice president, majority of the cabinet, and then 2/3 of both houses is final. And so it's not subject to a judicial review or medical review or anything else. But functionally, it functions like impeachment, except it's a higher bar. Impeachment, you just need 2/3 of the Senate. For 25th Amendment removal, you need 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate if the president refutes it. Now, like your conspiracy tales would be that Trump is kidnapped or whoever the president is kidnapped and he can't get this communication to Congress that he's really actually not incapacitated, etc. So that's how it functions. Now, there is a caveat provision. The majority of the cabinet provision can be substituted by Congress. The amendment itself says either a majority of the cabinet or whomever Congress chooses. I suspect that what Pelosi's really up to, aside from trying to elevate the issue in the public eye, is to change that from majority of the cabinet to someone that Congress appoints, so that then they would only need the vice president to go along. And if they could get the vice president to go along, then they could do it. Now, there's actually a double conspiracy here. The double conspiracy would be the vice president replaces the president. Then the Congress elects its own vice president, which can happen in that scenario. And then that new vice president, along with Congress, throws out the newly elected. So, as they put Pence in, and then they remove Pence under the pretext and I have no doubt there's some crazy professional class Democrats that are actually brainstorming these kind of nutty notions. And somehow they showed up in Pelosi's commission.
Well, and I've got to tell you, look, so when Trump gets out of the hospital, when he gets out of Walter Reed after his bout with COVID, or while he's still being treated for it, for anybody who's taken steroids before, you might be able to perceive that it's not manic, but it's sort of it's a more hyper mode. And yeah. I mean, I was watching Trump. There was no question. I got the impression that this was sort of like potentially a steroid, caffeinated type discourse. It was definitely faster paced than a lot of the stuff that he had been doing before that, maybe because he's feeling better versus not better. So, I mean, I could see people saying he's out of his mind. He's saying things, and now he's going on Rush Limbaugh and dropping the F-bomb. He's clearly got to be out of his mind. As if dropping the F-bomb publicly is somehow more a sign of losing your mind than dropping the insults privately, which is what all the other presidents have done. But so, I mean, it's an interesting thing. Is it a ploy to go after Trump? Who who could initiate it? Like who initiates it? Any interested party, or does it have to be the vice president?
Has to be the vice president, and he needs a majority of the cabinet to go with him.
Okay, so it's really not going anywhere. No matter how objective would the decline have to be in order for there to be another method? I mean, I guess it would just go back to impeachment then, right? If the vice president. Okay.
I mean, functionally, in fact, impeachment's easier than the 25th Amendment, because impeachment doesn't require the vice president's consent. The impeachment doesn't require cabinet's consent. The impeachment does not require 2/3 of the House. So the impeachment is functionally easier than is this.
And you know what? Now I've just talked myself into my own theory, which would be to raise such a stink about the 25th, and then when the vice president refuses to do it, then they have no choice but to go for a second round of impeachments if he gets elected.
Impeach the vice president first, try to put their own person. Yeah, I mean, there's a bunch of crazy conspiracy theories out there. Years ago, Einstein brought a guy over from Germany that was escaping Nazi Germany, and he did his constitution test that you do as part of your citizenship process. That was more detailed then than it is now. And what was fascinating is he kept identifying inherent flaws in the Constitution. Because, for example, there's actually a provision whereby the Archivist of the United States could declare himself king constitutionally under our existing jurisprudence. And that basically it's what it is that the Archivist is the sole person who Congress has delegated the power to determine who can and cannot decide whether the Constitution has been amended. So the Archivist could declare that an amendment has passed and has declared he, the Archivist, the new king, and has disbanded all other forms of government in the United States. So it's one of those loopholes that if you play it out rationally, you can actually create. Well, this guy, the Einstein professor, he identified like 30 of them, and Einstein finally had to tell him to shut up because he was panicking the investigator, because he was like, "There's this flaw, there's this flaw, you got a problem here." They could back. So, but the 25th Amendment actually is not an easy one to use. It was designed to be very, very difficult and to truly only apply in cases of incapacity where the president cannot dispute or controvert his incapacity.
Well, I'm reluctant to call it a conspiracy theory because we know they have been talking about a second impeachment. Even some lawyers have been talking about impeaching him again.
Pelosi clearly plans on it, using it as a second coup technique. I mean, there's no question about that. I mean, that she wouldn't be creating a commission to talk about it. And I'm sure they want to shift from the cabinet to some other congressional body. And then they want to figure out a way whether they could replace Pence as VP first, and then they could control the whole process. Now, the problem again is they need the president somehow to not controvert it, because they'll never have 2/3 votes in both the House and the Senate for this to occur.
I wouldn't even call it a conspiracy theory. I was just like, that raised the 25th idea enough when the vice president doesn't act, say we have no choice but to impeach a second time. Now, I pulled myself out of the stream trying to bring up Ricky Davis's super chat, which I lost now, but it said, could Trump go after Pelosi or someone for the apparent coup taking place right now, or is it not worth it? Not worth it. I think it's impossible, Robert. I mean, this is all politics. There's nothing sanctionable in this.
No. It is just politics. Well, if I was Trump, I would say I recommend a different chain of command. Let's remove the Speaker of the House from ever being within the chain of command structure. Saying, the Pelosi's probably incapacitated, might have some drinking issues. I'm concerned about it. And so I want to have someone other than the Speaker of the House be number 3 in case of a disaster. We can't have her be number 3. That would be his way of paying her back politically. But but no, there's nothing legally you can do about it.
And it wasn't a joke, but everything reads so sarcastically on Twitter. Is there the equivalent of a 25th Amendment for the Speaker of the House, or is it just how would they get, hypothetically, if people wanted to get Pelosi out?
Only the House can vote her out.
Okay,
and even that there's constitutional limits on. They tried to do that some years ago to Adam Clayton Powell in New York, and the court ultimately determined there were limits on how they could do that. So generally Congress has carte blanche authority, but it's not complete. They have to abide by their own rules. There's other protocols they have to abide by that put some constitutional constraints in their ability to control their own membership. But only Congress can remove the Speaker of the House.
Because I mean, it's if Trump wanted to be a jerk, he could flip the Nancy's 25th accusation on her for the reasons you mentioned, and for a number of other reasons. Mm-hmm. Her behavior could probably be argued to be more erratic and more incomprehensible than Trump on his worst day. And if you want to flip the argument, like, the way you wanted to flip the argument on Judge Sullivan in terms of his inquiring into the executive, flip the 25th on Nancy and some of the speeches she's given, and raise that stink. And now Dashun's rule says, I thought they seek a form of a committee that decides yes or no, not POTUS incapacitated. She picks the types of people that go on the committee. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, apparently that's what she's talking about, but that's inconsequential because that committee doesn't have power unless the House and the Senate, and I think this was her thought process, was that they were going to replace the majority of the cabinet provision with their own committee. But she would have to get the Senate to go along with that, number one. And number two, she'd still have to, under the amendment, still have to get the vice president to go along with it. And then number three, if the president disputes it, has to get 2/3 votes out of both the House and the Senate to go along with it. So, like I said, it's a pipe dream.
All right, and we got Topo Musicale says it was JFK's assassination that prompted the 25th. It ended up being signed by Johnson in 1967. And I'm going to make the prediction now. I don't think it's that much of a brainy prediction. My reading on how this law is going to be applied to the politics, because this magical overlap of law and politics, they're going to harp on the 25th Amendment for as long as they can, bring it to social awareness, public awareness. When Vice President doesn't heed to the calls of Pelosi, they're going to use it as the basis for a second impeachment if Trump gets reelected, and possibly even before. But probably if he gets reelected, we don't have enough time left.
Yeah.
And if Biden gets, the idea of getting Biden out if he gets elected, I see that as being the lesser of the plausible inspirations, because there's no real motivation to get Kamala in there over Biden once Biden gets elected. I think they'd want to keep Biden in sort of as a president, a figurehead. Okay, it might be a good segue now into Sullivan.